And now it is my pleasure to introduce Rondi Nordahl. Rondi is an AmeriCorps member serving as the Aquatic Reserve's Monitoring and Stewardship Coordinator at Resources, an environmental nonprofit based in Bellingham, Washington. In this role, she assists the Citizen Stewardship Committee of Fidalgo Bay and Cherry Point Aquatic Reserves with the implementation of citizen science and outreach programs. While growing up in the Pacific Northwest, she developed a love for the natural beauty of the region, which has driven her towards a career in resource management. She earned a BS in environmental science from Western Washington University and comes with a background in fisheries science, habitat restoration, citizen science, and public outreach.
All right, so thank you for the introduction. Again, I'm Rondi and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Aquatic Reserve's Monitoring and Stewardship Coordinator at Resources, which is a local environmental nonprofit. And today I'll be giving you a brief overview of our intertidal monitoring work at the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. I'm going to start things off with a brief land acknowledgement. I'd also like to note that it's important to understand that land acknowledgements are just an easy first step and that more action is needed to support the treaties and local tribes. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples whose tribal treaty rights we support and for whose enduring care of the lands and waters we are deeply grateful. In particular, I'll note that Lummi, Nooksack, Swinomish, Squamish, and Tulalip tribes are federally recognized tribes with usual and accustomed areas at Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. You can learn more about Cherry Point and the area you're zooming in from by visiting nativeland.ca, the link on the screen, which is an interactive map of Indigenous territories around the world. And so here's a brief overview of my talk today, where I'll go over some introductory information, briefly describe site setup, review the results, and note next steps. My goal today is for you to walk away from this presentation with a greater understanding of what these surveys are, why they're important, and the diversity within Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. So here I'll address a few questions to get the ball rolling. On the right is a map of the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve in purple, with our 4 sites marked with star icons. So what is the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve? The reserve is part of the Department of Natural Resources Aquatic Reserves program, which aims to protect important aquatic habitats across the state. Cherry Point was designated as a reserve in 2010 and is in the process of its first 10-year management plan review. Intertidal surveys are important because over time we're able to get a baseline for what habitat features and species we should expect to find. This data can be important for resource managers at DNR as they can assess species and resources present in the reserve, as well as have a reference for when there's a disruption such as an oil spill, climate event, or if there's a change in species presence and absence. And I also want to take a moment to highlight just how important volunteers are to this effort. Conducting a full survey would be really difficult without our team of great lead naturalists and volunteers. Plus, the lead naturalists bring expert knowledge that even some staff can't compare to. I certainly can't. And the work also just feels so much more meaningful when we have members of the public engaged, learning, and having fun. I went one slide too far. All right, so I'm going to keep this pretty brief and simple, but if you want more details, feel free to save it to the Q&A or send me an email. I have my contact information at the end of my presentation. So here on the right is a color-coded map of a site with everything set up. So first what we do is we set the profile line that we use to record beach slope, and that's indicated by the vertical purple line. Then we set transects along the +1, 0, and -1 low tide lines as the tide goes out. And those are indicated by the horizontal blue lines. From there, we set up the quadrats, which we use to record percent cover and individual counts, the small orange boxes. And as the tide goes out, we'll also have lead naturalists cataloging as many species as they can find in given sections called swaths. And those are the large green boxes. And we also have built-in quality control checks during data collection and entry to ensure good data quality. And so here we get to kind of the real focus of the presentation, getting into the data and results. And so I'll present on 2 sites. One is Barnacle Rock, which is more of a rocky, cobbly shoreline located at the north end of the reserve. And that photo on the left on the top is just a quadrat photo from Barnacle Rock. And then the other site that I'll be talking about is what we call Intalco Beach, which is an area characterized by finer sediment and is located at the southern end of the reserve, near the aluminum smelter. And below on the left is a photo of the same tide level and quadrat from Intalco. And I chose these 2 sites because they represent very different sediment, algal, and animal characteristics or abundances, which just really highlights the diversity encompassed within the reserve. There are some sites that I could have compared where it would have just been a lot of the same, which doesn't make for a super, I guess, interesting presentation when you're just talking about, this looks great, this is the same. So we get to look at a little bit different parts of the reserve. And for each site, I'll cover 3 graphs. One looking at elevation profile showing elevation change along the profile line. One for the average percent of cover species observed in the quadrats, and one for the average number of individually counted species observed in quadrats. And for the quadrat data, I averaged across all 12 quadrats, which is 3 tide levels per survey to limit my scope and the time for this presentation. There are some interesting finer details that can be teased out by looking at tide level averages, but those would eat up a lot of time and would also probably be evaluated in the next major intertidal review by resources staff. So I'll start off with Barnacle Rock, which, as you can see from this photo, is a very squishy and slippery site, lots of algae. And so I'll get started with elevation profiles. And for the most part, these don't change much over time. There might be some spikes where a log washes up after a high tide, or maybe a rock shifts around on the beach. The photo on the right is an example of how our profile and transect lines sometimes run into objects, like the big rock that that person is sitting on. And those can show up in the elevation profile. And one thing to note too is that even though these look pretty consistent over time, we have to recognize that there are feeder bluffs around the site, as well as most of our other sites at Cherry Point, which periodically have slides that deposit sediment and debris on the beach. And so this is kind of an example of why recording beach elevation profiles is important. So this is our Neptune Beach site near Phillips 66, north of Intalco, where on the left, a few years ago, our starting point marker was once very clearly visible and accessible. But now, as evidenced by the photo on the right, it's been covered by vegetation and debris, which may have been from a small slide the year or sometime in the year before we surveyed this last summer. It didn't seem to affect the elevation profile too much, but it's definitely a reminder that larger slides could occur and alter beach conditions. And so now we're getting into some of the species data. And here we have average percent cover. Most of what we see here is green seaweed and barnacles, with some amounts of other things like aggregating anemones and red or brown seaweed and mussels. Kind of one of the first things that you'll realize, like, this makes a lot of sense when you look at the site and look at the quadrat photos, because like when you first get there, there's just a lot of green algae covering everything on the rocks. But then once you reveal it and remove it, there's barnacles and all kinds of other critters. As kind of seen in the photo, there's barnacles and a bunch of stuff once you remove the algae. And so some of the other critters that you can see, there's a lot more variety, and mostly what we see are anemones, limpets, shelled snails, and hermit crabs, with kind of a more moderate number of things like amphipods, isopods, and crabs. One thing that was really cool that we saw last year, we even spotted a few crab larvae called megalope, which was really interesting. There's a photo of one of them on the upper right, which is interesting. I'm working to learn more about larval crab, which also coincides with the previous talk on the Birch Bay light traps. And so next I'll get into the data from Intalco. And even just looking at it from this photo, you can see that it's pretty different. Definitely not as squishy, slippery, and cobbly as barnacle rock. Again, much like with barnacle rock, we don't see a lot of change in the elevation profile. The lines generally follow the same trend and fit around the same elevation levels. One thing to note, unfortunately, with the 2015 data, it stands out a little higher than other years. And that's just from an error with the way some of the data was recorded that I was unfortunately not able to correct before the presentation today. But just know that like that line more or less fits in with the other ones. And so for percent cover, it looks very different from barnacle rock. Although, so it's mostly comprised of green algae with some red algae and barnacles. And on the y-axis, I have it set to the same level as we see at barnacle rock. And so when I was going through the data, in reviewing it and prepping it, I noticed that there were just a lot of zeros, and I was really curious about like why that is. And what was driving that. And more or less, it's just because of the fine peat gravel and sand substrate, which doesn't support algal growth the same way that the rocky habitat at barnacle rock does. And it's an interesting feature that separates it from our other sites, even including Neptune Beach, which is pretty close by. And sort of similar with the percent cover data, the counts are pretty low. And most of what we see tends to be amphipods, crabs, shelled snails, and anemones. And we likely see these low counts because of the low algal communities, aka the food that these critters use, and not a lot of habitat complexity from rocks and larger substrate. So in other words, like there just isn't as much food or hiding spots for critters to be at Intalco compared to some of our other sites. And so kind of what does this all mean and how does it come together? So in summary, elevation profiles don't change a whole lot over the years, but it's good to record this data so that we have a solid baseline to compare to in the event of a hillslide. Depositing substantial debris, which is something that we'll have to consider when we go out to check our sites this year, given the reports of a lot of slides from the feeder bluffs this winter from the heavy rains. And just it's also important to note that our sites can vary a lot in terms of their species diversity and abundance. Barnacle rock has a lot in terms of percent cover, individual counts, and species observed. Intalco is a little less diverse. Some people have called it boring, but I think all of our sites are important. And after surveying for so many years, we're able to more or less see what species are most prevalent at each site over the years surveyed and kind of what to expect there. And moving forward, we'll continue monitoring as a tool to gather baseline data and monitor for changes. And we've also gotten some interesting feedback to potentially transition away from surveying at Intalco and instead find a site that's more interesting and complex and supports more marine life. I think one of the ideas for that is that we've collected enough data to show that there isn't much at Intalco, and we could focus our efforts on establishing baselines for another area that might have the potential for more loss in the event of a disturbance. And in closing, I want to acknowledge all of the hard work put in by resources, MRC, DNR, and other staff that have come before me, as well as our volunteers. There's a lot that goes into designing these monitoring programs, implementing them in the first few years, and then yearly upkeep and surveying. Extra kudos to our small group of very dedicated lead naturalists who we rely on for so much. And yeah, so that's my presentation. Here I have my personal work email and a generic email that forwards my way. And I have a few links that I can drop in the chat that go to resources, web pages about the reserve, and also how to get involved with monitoring projects. And so I think we can get to some Q&A questions if there's anything.
Thank you so much, Rondi. That was very interesting. I am not seeing any questions in the chat right now. Looking for anybody with a raised hand and seeing anybody. I'm missing you. Please feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat. Melissa Miner asks, were your 2021 surveys done pre or post heat wave? If after, wondering if you saw any obvious impacts.
Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the exact dates that we surveyed. I think some of them were post heat wave, like some of the ones at Fidalgo Bay were post heat wave, and some were beforehand. Our surveys occur between May and August, depending on the sites that we survey. So there are some that we could look at, but we don't have like pre and post from this year for a given site. And so I can't really say if we've seen any clear impacts or not, because we don't survey the sites every year lately.
Monitor for industrial pollutants?
No, we don't monitor for industrial pollutants. So like we don't really perform like water quality monitoring or heavy metals at the sites. We're just looking at like the species composition, elevation profiles, and substrate.
And what does a data collecting day look like? How many people join you and how long are you out there?
Yeah, so that really varies from site to site, and things have changed a little bit since COVID, where we can't have quite as many people. But from my understanding and from what I've heard about past years, we'll typically have like anywhere from 8 to maybe 15 people at a survey. I think that includes staff as well. The days can be kind of long, especially if you have to really trek out to a site like Barnacle Rock. We access that lately from Birch Bay State Park. And so that's about a 30-minute walk, which can take a little longer, especially if you're carrying a bunch of gear. But typically we estimate that a full survey day could take about 4 to like up to 8 hours, depending on how involved you are with the survey. So it's a full-time commitment for the day, but it's like really cool to be out on the beach for a whole survey. You see so much as the tide goes out and get to know so much and learn so much from the lead naturalists.
It's a very cool part of our shoreline for sure. Any more questions in the chat? We have ended a little bit early, so it would allow for a bit of an afternoon break before our next session starts at 2:15. And if you have any questions that you're thinking of and don't have time to put them in the chat, Rondi is sharing her contact information right there. But for now, we'll just give you time to have a 10-minute or so break before our next presentation.
Awesome. And I'm just dropping a couple of those links in the chat as well for anyone interested.
We'll keep it open then for a few minutes.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.